right. We will get started here because this is probably going to be a pretty thick day. So I will start us off with a word of prayer this morning. Lord, thank you for allowing us to be able to come into your house today. Thank you for allowing us to be able to draw breath and to continue living. And we pray that we will use that gift of life to further your kingdom and to share your news throughout the world. And we pray that today you will give us right understanding of history, right understanding of the work of nations, how they work, and Lord, that we would see your glorious hand in history. In your name, amen. All right. Good morning. Today is going to be a little bit of a detour. Well, not a little bit. It's going to be a large detour from what we have been talking about. A little bit of a special episode, as it were. And I'd like to start off with our scripture for this morning from the 79th Psalm, which is one of Asaph's Psalms, starting at verse 10. And he writes, "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' Let there be known among the nations in our sight the avenging of the blood of your servants which has been shed. Let the groaning of the prisoner come before you, according to the greatness of your power. Preserve those who are appointed to die. And return to our neighbors sevenfold in their bosom their reproach with which they have reproached you, O Lord." So this is a discussion of a time, one of the many times in Israel's history, where they have been set upon by foreign invaders as a proximate result of their paganism. They have gone back into paganistic practices, and so therefore God has turned them over to the enemy and has allowed the temple to be desecrated, has allowed Jerusalem to be desecrated. And here Asaph is making this psalm, writing this song where he says, Lord, essentially, remember us, your chosen people. Remember your covenant with us. Let the groaning of the prisoner come before you and repay to the enemy sevenfold what has been done here today. This is another theme that we see throughout the Old Testament, that Israel prays to God and that God would punish the enemies of Israel at an increased exchange for which Israel has been hurt or insulted. The reason I choose this passage today is something has come to my attention which disturbs me greatly. Anybody here watch Tucker Carlson? A couple. Has anybody seen the episode of Tucker Carlson with Darryl Cooper? Darryl Cooper is a somewhat rising historian on the internet, the podcast scene. Darryl Cooper is a former Department of Defense employee who is just taken into doing podcasts on different historical topics. For example, one of his most popular ones is on the Jonestown Massacre, Jim Jones and his cult and everybody drinking the Kool-Aid and those types of things. I think that was a 12-hour-long podcast, something to that effect. Well, anyways, Tucker had Mr. Cooper on his show, and Tucker was interviewing him, and they get to the subject of World War II. And I will say, at least for the start, I thought this was a pretty good episode. I thought he was making some interesting points. And then they get to the subject of World War II. And Mr. Cooper made a statement which absolutely boggled my mind. He said that in his belief, Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. And I'm sitting there going, I don't understand how you've come to that conclusion, considering the alternative. And Mr. Cooper made a statement that I think is something of a logical fallacy. He states, and even though I say that Winston Churchill is the chief villain, I don't mean to say that Hitler and the Nazis, I'm greatly paraphrasing this, of course, as well, but I don't mean to say that Hitler and the Nazis weren't bad. And I'm sitting here going, as a human being, we logically would infer that if you're calling somebody the chief villain, the opposite of the chief villain, therefore, then has to be the protagonist. Kind of an either-or situation there, especially when we're talking about World War II, which is ultimately seen as a struggle between good and evil. This constant strain between the dark forces of tyranny and the forces of liberty and righteousness. So, the other thing that disturbs me about this video as I start scrolling through the YouTube comments section, which can be an interesting place to go. And as I'm scrolling through the YouTube comments section, I'm starting to notice people quoting a quote that I'm familiar with, but not giving the author's name, or abbreviating the author's name to some initials. And the quote is, very loosely, "After I am dead, my spirit shall rise from my ashes and prove to the world that I was correct." That was a statement made by Adolf Hitler. Why people within the conservative movement are quoting Adolf Hitler in a seemingly positive sense, I have absolutely no idea. What concerns me in addition to this is both with Tucker as well as Candace Owens in the last few months, there's been this increasing discussion of a Jewish conspiracy that basically the Jews are lying, the Jews are dishonest, the Jews are trying to use the United States to protect their borders, and that's not our job. It's the Jews' job to do that. We shouldn't be involved in this type of thing. This is disturbing. I never thought that in America I would have to reiterate why Hitler is a bad guy and why Winston Churchill, at least nominally, is a good guy. I'm not trying to say that Churchill was a bastion of righteousness and moral clarity. The man had his faults, but so does every world leader. The reason I put this phrase on the board here, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. This was the rallying cry as they elected Adolf Hitler in Germany in the early 1930s. And it means one people, one kingdom, one leader. And this is a phrasing that you'll see all throughout Nazi ideology, Nazi rhetoric. It's always this discussion of the one people, the one kingdom, the one true Aryan race, the master race. This is something that we've all learned in school, rightfully so. It's something you should not forget, the propaganda that was used to sway an entire generation of Germans into this bloody conflict that we call the Second World War. And what I seem to notice is as I look through the comment sections, one of the common themes is basically if you look at the state at which Germany is now, where they're busing in millions of these migrants that have no common shared heritage with the people of Germany, their religion is against the ideals of Western civilization. They rape these girls in the subways. I mean, this is bad what is going on in Germany. And it seems that to a lot of these people, the response should be, well, Hitler should have won and we wouldn't be dealing with this. That is an absolutely dangerous path to go down. Again, I never thought in America I'd have to explain this to the detail I'm going to try to explain it today, but the Nazis wouldn't have dealt with it because they would have killed anybody that wasn't Aryan. That's kind of the whole point of Nazism. International Jewry is responsible for our loss in the First World War, is one of the big points that the Nazis make. International Jewry is responsible for the subjugation of the German people after the First World War, and it's international Jewry that is responsible for the rise of communism within the world. That the Jews and the Bolsheviks walk hand in hand together, and there is an international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to bring the entire world into a communist state. which should sound ludicrous to you because it is. But there are now people in this day and age that are starting to go back down that path. That it is an international Jewish conspiracy that all of these Muslims are being bussed into Great Britain and Germany and France, and that the appropriate seeming response would be to have had Hitler won and this wouldn't be a problem. It's disturbing to see people that I typically tend to value, Candace and Tucker being the two prominent ones there, going down this, I would say, almost a lunatic type path. So, I'm going to give you some quotes here because I like to let the people of history speak for themselves. This is a copy of Mein Kampf. Everybody should own a copy of Mein Kampf, not because it is some great luminary into the future, but rather this should be an example to you of how people get drawn into darkness. In fact, this copy from the 1960s says, "A dream of violence that was abandoned for a far grimmer reality." It's a very true statement. Originally published in 1927, after the beer hall putsch where Hitler and the early Nazi party tried to seize control over the German government, and it failed terribly, and Hitler gets sentenced to a very light prison term. And while he's in this prison term, he writes this book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. This is one of the things you'll notice with Hitler a lot, is he constantly frames himself that he is in this great eternal struggle to rescue the German people, to rescue the one true race. That it's upon his shoulders and the shoulders of the party to go forth and rescue Germany from the rest of the world. When we start talking about the racial theories of Nazism. Hence, he says, it is no accident that the first cultures arose in places where the Aryan, in his encounters with lower peoples, subjugated them and bent them to his will. They then became the first technical instrument in the service of a developing culture. Thus, the road which the Aryan had to take was clearly marked out. As a conqueror, he subjected the lower beings and regulated their practical activity under his command, according to his will and for his aims. But in directing them to a useful, though arduous activity, he not only spared the life of those he subjected, perhaps he gave them a fate that was better than their previous so-called freedom. Look at how we're phrasing this. That the Aryans all the way back to ancient times, this is kind of a fictitious race, by the way. This is a mystical thing that he and the high command came up with early on in the history of Nazism. But that the Aryan has gone forth into the world and traditionally, through his might, brings these lower subhuman classes of people under his control. And by bringing them under his control, he brings them to a newer and better reality simply out of his sheer will. And that they should be glad that they have been used and subjugated by the Aryan, because even through their use, they have been brought to a higher level of usefulness. This is madness. As long as and again, freedom being put in quotation marks. Freedom is not something that's valued in Nazism. Again, not something I thought I'd have to say in America, but is becoming very apparent that it's something that needs to be said. This is the antithesis of liberty. This is the direct antithesis to everything the Founding Fathers fought for and held dear. Period. It stands in direct opposition to all of it. It stands in direct opposition to the Magna Carta and the series of English laws that brought freedom to the men of England. It stands as a violent, oppressive worldview. Hitler continues, as long as he ruthlessly upheld the master attitude, not only did he really remain master, but also the preserver and increaser of culture. For culture was based exclusively on his abilities and hence on his actual survival. As soon as the subjected people began to raise themselves up and probably approached the conqueror in language, the sharp dividing wall between master and servant fell. This is something this next sentence is very central to Nazi ideology. The Aryan gave up the purity of his blood. The purity of the blood idea that you see sprinkled throughout Mein Kampf will ultimately foster the euthanasia program, Action T4. It will foster the concentration camps. It will foster the death camps. It will foster the Einsatzgruppen, who before the concentration camps were built, were going around Eastern Europe and rounding up every Jew they could find and shooting them in the open air. Whole companies of men set aside for this one task, to go around the countryside and murder men, women, and children with any means possible. When they would go low on ammunition, it was not uncommon for them, for example, to go to a river where there's a bridge and tie husbands and wives together or siblings together, shoot one and let them fall into the river, and the dead body drags the other down where they're drowned. Because they were so focused on this thought that any drop of non-pure blood in the Aryan race would taint the whole thing, that our blood is hereditary. Everything that is wonderful about us is passed on through our blood. So if the Jew contaminates our blood, the bloodline is wasted. If the Slav contaminates our bloodline, the bloodline is wasted. If the gypsy contaminates our bloodline, the bloodline is wasted. So we must remove these people from the earth. We must prevent their ability to breed. Over 400,000 people, roughly, were involuntarily sterilized by the Nazi government. Vasectomies for men and tubal ligation for the women. Some of them didn't survive it either. You are not worthy enough to breed because of your blood. The Aryan gave up the purity of his blood and therefore lost his sojourn in the paradise which he had made for himself. This stands in direct opposition to the Bible as well. The Bible says God is the creator of paradise. God is the bringer of paradise. It is through the sacrifice of the only true blood, the only sovereign blood that's worth anything, which is the blood of Christ, is how paradise is purchased for the damned. And this, we're getting this almost Nietzschean idea, the Übermensch, the Superman, must take his will and force reality to his will. That the one great Superman will come and by his sheer power mold the world into his ideal. He, being the Aryan, became submerged in the racial mixture and gradually more and more lost his cultural capacity until at last, not only mentally but also physically, he began to resemble the subjected Aborigines more than his own ancestors. For a time he could live on the existing cultural benefits, but then putrefaction set in and he fell a prey to oblivion. Thus, cultures and empires collapsed to make place for new formations. Blood mixture and the resultant drop in the racial level is the sole cause of the dying out of old cultures. For men do not perish as a result of lost wars, but by the loss of that force of resistance which is contained only in pure blood. All who are not of good race in this world are chaff. Think about that statement. This was written in 1925 and published in 1927. So when I hear Darryl Cooper, when I hear people in the comment or read people in the comment section saying things like, well, he wasn't really going to attack Great Britain. He wasn't really going to attack America. Why did we have to get involved? We should have just let Hitler go and fight in Russia and defeat the communists because they were a greater enemy. This is just as deadly of an enemy as Marxism. If you think about it, it took Stalin approximately 40 years to kill 20 million people. They kill 11 million in 5. Because the entire point of this ideology is to wipe out everyone who is not pure blood. You actually almost have a civil war that occurs in Germany at the start of the Second World War, because as the fighting goes on into the east, into Russia, there is an order which is signed by Himmler, a secret order, which says that all SS men that are returning on leave from the east have permission to sleep with whatever German woman they find to continue the propagation of the pure race. So you, as a regular German soldier, your wife, under that law, could be taken by an SS man and he could impregnate her, because that SS man is of a higher blood than you are, and his offspring is of a higher, greater value than yours. And you actually had a number of German generals in the regular army that said, if this continues, we will return and march on Berlin. So Himmler quietly put that program at ease, and they started the Lebensborn program, where they would capture children from Poland and other places that were deemed racially pure, blonde hair, blue eyes, and everything else, and they were abducted and brought into Germany and raised as German children, away from their parents. This is what this leads to. When you say that the rest of the races of the earth are chaff, you can now justify murdering everybody. They did not view us as Americans as equals, because they looked at us as Americans as inbreds, crossbreeds. Because an Italian could marry an Irish person. A German could marry a Slav. We didn't have rules about that sort of thing, except that blacks and whites couldn't get married, and that changed in the 1950s. They didn't like us. I didn't think I'd ever have to actually come out and say that. I thought that was kind of a given, in the same way that gravity is constant and sunlight makes plants grow. But this is where we are in our country today. And all occurrences in world history are only the expression of the race's instinct of self-preservation in the good or bad sense. A hyper-focus on race. He then, as he starts talking about Jewish religious doctrine in Mein Kampf, this idea that the Jews are the chosen people of God, which any reading of this book shows you that. Any reading of this book would prove that ultimately. It's another reason Hitler is not a Christian. For all the people on the left that want to say Hitler was a Christian, that's absolutely and totally false. Alan Bullock, one of Hitler's biographers, made the statement, I think it's very well worded. He said, in Hitler's eyes, Christianity was a religion fit only for slaves. He detested its ethics, in particular. Its teaching, he declared, was a rebellion against the natural law of selection by struggle and the survival of the fittest. Because we teach in Christianity that you feed the weak, that you clothe the weak, that you help those that are less fortunate than yourself. One of the barbaristic characterizations of Christianity in the Roman Empire was where the Romans, if you didn't want your baby, you could go throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Christians would pick up those babies and take them back and raise them and allow them to live. And we put value on life. Nazism does not, unless that life is a pure-blooded life. But this is what he has to say. I'm also pretty much just pulling quotes out of here, because you can pretty much open this book to any spot and find this kind of stuff. This is a madman's ramblings. The Jewish religious doctrine consists primarily in prescriptions for keeping the blood of Jewry pure and for regulating the relation of Jews among themselves, but even more with the rest of the world, in other words, with non-Jews. But even here it is by no means ethical problems that are involved, but extremely modest economic ones. Concerning the moral value of Jewish religious instruction, there are today and have been at all times rather exhaustive studies, not by Jews. The drivel of the Jews themselves on this subject is, of course, adapted to its purpose, which make this kind of religion seem positively monstrous according to Aryan conceptions. The best characterization is provided by the product of this religious education, the Jew himself. And watch here as he is then going to twist Christianity into his doctrine. His life is only of this world, and his spirit is inwardly as alien to true Christianity as his nature 2,000 years previous was to the great founder of the new doctrine. Of course, the latter made no secret of his attitude toward the Jewish people, and when necessary, he even took to the whip to drive from the temple of the Lord this adversary of all humanity. How have we twisted the Bible with that statement? He stood against the Pharisees, that is true, but not against the Jewish people. He came in his own words in fulfillment of the law and the prophets that Hitler just said is worthless. Any even superficial reading really of this will show you the man is not a Christian. Period. Ultimately, and this is something that a lot of research has been done, but Hitler, Himmler, and a number of those in the higher command of the Nazi Party believed in if we're going to talk about a religion, the Norse mythology. That the Norse gods of the Nordic peoples, again, the Nordic peoples being the sort of highest level of the Aryan race, that those gods are whom should be worshipped. And if you know anything about Nordic paganism, it's a very violent, bloody religion, which fits right into Nazi thought. He says, of course, in return, Christ was nailed to the cross, while our present-day party Christians debase themselves to begging for Jewish votes at election and later try to arrange political swindles with atheistic Jewish parties, and this against their own nation. On this first and greatest lie, that the Jews are not a race but a religion, more and more lies are based in necessary consequence. Among them is the lie with regard to the language of the Jew. For him it is not a means for expressing his thoughts, but a means for concealing them. When he speaks French, he thinks Jewish. And while he turns out German verses, in his life he only expresses the nature of his nationality. As long as the Jew has not become the master of the other peoples, he must speak their languages whether he likes it or not. But as soon as they became his slaves, they would all have to learn a universal language, so that by this additional means, the Jews could more easily dominate them. Again, this is like tinfoil hat kind of stuff. That there is this Jew behind the veil of everything. And that, as is described in Nazi propaganda, they actually had a phrase, the eternal Jew. And that the eternal Jew is constantly there. He's dirty. He's like a rat. He's always plotting against you, the good German, to take your money, to take your daughter, to take your house, to take your land. Nazism really gets into this blood and soil type idea, that our blood and the soil are tied together. It's one of the things that Hitler goes on at length about in Mein Kampf, is the need for quote-unquote Lebensraum, or living space for the German farmer. The Nazis viewed the urban areas, the cities, as corrupted. That urbanization was corrupted. Anything involved with the city was a corrupting influence. And so to reclaim the German spirit, the German peasant farmer must take control of the land and till it himself, and through that forceful use of his will, bring about a purer land and a purer blood. It goes contradictory to everything we believe in this nation. That any man can come here, and any man can own land, and any man can farm. These people that are conservative commentators who give even a slight pass to this man makes me very suspicious. Why are you giving any credence to this at all? It would be no different than if I saw a preacher get into a pulpit and say something to the effect of, well, Satan's name is Lucifer, which means light bringer. I mean, I know he's bad, but is he really that bad? Keep in mind, Satan is an attractive character for a reason. He's real. I'm not saying he's just a character, but he uses his beauty. Has anybody in here ever watched the Nuremberg rallies in the early 30s? Any of the newsreels? It's designed to awe you. I think it's the 1935 rally. They have it at nighttime, and if you can find the colored reel, there's a big giant gold eagle with the swastika. And it's an entirely firelit ceremony. Everybody's marching with torches. And Hitler's standing up there, and all of the light is focused on Hitler. And as bad as he was, I will give the man credit, he was a gifted orator. When you watch him speak, there is a dark charisma to that man. It's one of the things, for example, that intimidated King George of England when we get to World War II. Originally his name was Bertie, it was his nickname, and he had a quite severe stammer. There's a whole movie that was made about this, The King's Speech. It's very well done. If you ever get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend it. Colin Firth does an amazing job. But it's one of the things that bothers Bertie. When you watch Hitler speak, he is, I would say, the best speaker of all the world leaders at that time. Stalin didn't have to be a good speaker because Stalin had already seized control, and if you stopped clapping, if you were the first one to clap during one of his speeches at the end, you could get killed or sent to a gulag for stopping your clapping. He didn't have to be a good speaker because the party enforced you will be enthusiastic about what Stalin has to say. Hitler had to organically create this enthusiasm, which he did quite successfully. In their search for the purity of the blood, we talk about Action T4, the euthanasia program. This is the first real, I would say, bloodletting of the Holocaust. The Nazi high command comes up with this idea that within Germany itself, we already have this tainting of the blood. Part of what gets rolled into Nazism is the eugenics movement of the late Victorian era and then coming into the early 20th century. This idea that we as humans, because we understand science, we as humans can selectively determine who breeds and who does not breed, and we can create a better human race. It was popular here in America too. That's where we get Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood from. We can remove the black race from America by aborting their children. The Nazis take an interesting approach to this. They say, we can't use abortion because abortion kills too many German children that could be used for the military. But we also don't want to just have all the children around and living. So what they start doing is taking babies, and if these babies have developmental disabilities or it's shown that they have any kind of malformity, they are euthanized by lethal injection and burned up, and then their ashes are put in an urn and given to their parents with a bogus note about why they died. And then as time progresses, it goes onwards to adults. They go to the insane asylums and start literally carting them out in trucks, taking them to gas chambers and gassing them in what are supposed to be showers within some of these clinics with bottled carbon monoxide, and then burning them up and sending the ashes in urns to the families with bogus notes about why they died. In total, just with the euthanasia program in the first year or two, it's 250,000 people are killed this way in an effort to purify the German national blood. And then we look to what they do militarily and politically. Hitler goes after the Sudetenland, which is German-speaking land that they lost as a result of the First World War, as Great Britain and France and the United States decided we have to make it so that the Germans never are able to rise up again to pose a threat on the world stage. You're not allowed to have an army. You're not allowed to have a navy. You're not allowed to have these parts of your empire that used to exist. We will cut this up and try to prevent this from ever happening again. The problem is they got way too aggressive with it, and it's another reason we get Hitler, but that's, I think, a little bit outside what I want to talk about today. So they take the Sudetenland. Austria, their empire is broken up as a result of the First World War. They allied with the Germans, so they also lose their empire. And you actually have a good number of Austrians that are in favor of the Nazis. You actually have an entire wing of the Nazi party in Austria. Keep in mind, Hitler is an Austrian. It's this idea that all German-speaking people should be in one Reich. And as we get closer to 1937 and into 1938, the governor, or basically the president of Austria, is not a Nazi, and he wants to put it up as a vote to the whole people. Do you want to become a part of the German Empire, the new German Empire, or not? When Hitler realizes there's a possibility that this could be lost, they remove him. They actually shoot him. The Sturmabteilung, the stormtroopers of the Nazi party in Austria, assassinate the man. And then the Germans make basically demands upon the new ruler of Austria, and they go in there. It's called the Anschluss, and Austria is brought into the Reich. And then, of course, we get infamously to Poland on September the 1st, 1939. The Germans come from the west, the Soviets come from the east, and in the matter of a month, Poland ceases to exist. All of this keeping in mind that Hitler is violating treaties over and over and over and over again. One of the arguments that Mr. Cooper makes in Tucker Carlson's video is, well, Hitler made statements to Churchill that he wanted peace. They dropped leaflets on London saying, we don't want to fight you. If Hitler would have just signed, if Churchill would have just signed Hitler's peace accords, they would have been able to keep their empire. Nothing bad would have happened. And I'm sitting here going, are you that thick in the head? How many times does he have to violate a national treaty for you to realize the man is a liar? This is exactly what Churchill said to Chamberlain and the rest of the peace party within the parliament. One of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill. When will you realize that you cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in his mouth? Especially after Dunkirk, Great Britain did not have a land army that could fight in Europe. They were at the mercy of the Nazis because we didn't want to get involved. It's another statement that I thought was particularly interesting is Mr. Cooper says, Great Britain today, when I look at Great Britain today, I think, how could Churchill ever be a hero? And I'm sitting here going, well, by that logic, when you look at America today, how could George Washington ever be a hero? That's an absolutely illogical argument. It's been 80 years since the Second World War. A lot has happened in Great Britain in those 80 years. It is not the Great Britain of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was very opposed to Mohammedanism, as he called it. He would not have shipped in millions of Syrians and all these other types of people that would not have gone along with what Great Britain stands for. It's an illogical argument, but that's, again, going down a different path. And speaking of Winston Churchill, I want to read you some of what he has to say. So I read you what Hitler says with his ideology in Mein Kampf. Listen here to the words of Winston Churchill. This was a speech given in 1940, shortly after he becomes the prime minister, and he's basically saddled with how are you going to deal with this? And this is what Churchill says. He says, having received His Majesty's commission, I have formed an administration of men and women of every party and of almost every point of view. Hitler would not have done that. He killed his opposition. Just throwing that out there. We have differed and quarreled in the past, but now one bond unites us all, to wage war until victory is won, and never to surrender ourselves to servitude and shame, whatever the cost and the agony may be. This is one of the most awe-striking periods in the long history of France and Britain. It is also beyond doubt the most sublime. side by side, unaided except by their kith and kin in the great dominions and by the wide empires which rest beneath their shield. Side by side, the British and French peoples have advanced to rescue not only Europe, but mankind from the foulest and most soul-destroying tyranny which has ever darkened and stained the pages of history. Behind them, behind us, behind the armies and fleets of Britain and France, gather a group of shattered states and bludgeoned races. The Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Dutch, the Belgians, upon all of whom the long night of barbarism will descend, unbroken even by a star of hope, unless we conquer, as conquer we must, as conquer we shall. Today is Trinity Sunday. Centuries ago, words were written to be a call and a spur to the faithful servants of truth and justice. He's going to quote from the Maccabees in the Apocrypha here. He states, "Arm yourselves, and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict. For it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altars. As the will of God is in heaven, even so let it be." This is where Maccabeus sends his sons to war to defeat the Greeks in the Seleucid Empire. Another speech from 1938, he says, "The lights are going out. We must arm." We are confronted with another theme. It is not a new theme. It leaps out upon us from the dark ages: racial persecution, religious intolerance, deprivation of free speech, the conception of the citizen as a mere soulless faction of the state. To this has been added the cold of war. Children, he's talking about Germany here, are to be taught in their earliest schooling the delights and profits of conquest and aggression. Remember, Hitler's the one that said, "I want to raise a generation of young people devoid of a conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel, as tough as leather and as hard as Krupp steel." Those words are memorialized at the entrance to what's left of the Auschwitz concentration camp. This is what was being taught to the children. A whole mighty community has been drawn painfully by severe privations into a warlike frame. They are held in this condition, which they relish no more than we do, by a party organization several million strong, who derive all kinds of profits, good and bad, from the upkeep of the regime. Like the communists, the Nazis tolerate no opinion but their own. Like the communists, they feed on hatred. Like the communists, they must seek from time to time, and always at shorter intervals, a new target, a new prize, a new victim. The dictator in all his pride is held in the grip of his party machine. He can go forward, but he cannot go back. He must blood his hounds and show them sport, or else, like Actaeon of old, be devoured by them. All strong without, he is all weak within. As Byron wrote 100 years ago, "These pagod things of saber sway, with fronts of brass and feet of clay." No one must, however, underrate the power and efficiency of a totalitarian state, where the whole population of a great country, amiable, good-hearted, peace-loving people, are gripped by the neck and by the hair by a communist or a Nazi tyranny. Churchill equates the two of them together. And this is, as we get to the close here, this is what he has to say. And he's addressing the American Congress here. He says, "We must arm. Britain must arm. America must arm. If through an earnest desire for peace we have placed ourselves at a disadvantage, we must make up for it by redoubled exertions, and if necessary, by fortitude and suffering. We shall no doubt arm. Britain, casting away the habits of centuries, will decree national service upon her citizens. The British will stand erect and will face whatever may be coming. Is this a call to war? Does anyone pretend that preparation for resistance to aggression is unleashing war? I declare it to be the sole guarantee of peace. We need the swift gathering of forces to confront not only military but moral aggression. The resolute and sober acceptance of their duty by the English-speaking peoples and by all the nations, great and small, who wish to walk with them. Their faithful and zealous comradeship would almost between night and morning clear the path of progress and banish from all our lives the fear which already darkens the sunlight to hundreds of millions of men. They were alone until December 7th, 1941, when we were attacked by the Japanese. Mr. Cooper states, Churchill was a terrorist. He firebombed the Black Forest. He firebombed Dresden. He bombed all these different civilian targets within Germany. Go watch the Nuremberg rallies. They stood there and yelled Heil Hitler along with them. You chose this path, not us. They bombed London. They struck the first blow in Poland. Churchill, left with no other option, had to fight. War is terrible. It's a horrible business. But when it comes to fighting or giving the world over to that insanity, I'm glad he fought. And I will leave it on this note. It disturbs me that conservative commentators are trying to go retroactively into history and revise what they believe to fit their modern political ideas about Israel's defense of her nation. So, there we go. That's it. That's all I have for you.